Hi, this is Van Staub, and I lead our embedded technical partnerships for Watson Work and Watson Talent. The following is a webinar discussing how IBM business partners can integrate IBM Kenexa Talent Frameworks into their own solution or service. Now, IBM Kenexa Talent Frameworks is the product itself is a collection of human resources related content, and it's quite a bit of content. So we'll spend some time here looking at the organization and the type of that content. So this content, it's delivered in various formats. It'll come from IBM down to either the business partner or directly to the client. And one of the lead formats that we often show is Excel. And we show Excel because it makes visualizing the Talent Frameworks data very easy. So for example, here's the Healthcare 3.0 competencies file. And what this is showing, in each column, a competency. So we have knowledge of organization, we have operating functions, products and services, and this list goes on. And then we have the individual fields or data points for that competency. So we have this level 1 for descriptions of basic understanding, and then goes to level 4. We have individual learning references listed here, up to 15 of them. And then we have groups of development statements, coaching tips, and interview questions. So it makes understanding what a competency is and what data it is made of or composed of very easy to understand. Unfortunately, Excel is not a great data format when we talk about integrating this information into other systems. You'll find that we'll have to use either open source or proprietary libraries, and doing this and understanding how to use these libraries can become a little cumbersome. So when we review and look at this data and try and ingest it into another system, we tend to fall back to two other formats. And those other formats are tab delimited files and XML files. And so we'll take a look at the tab delimited files first. We'll look at the Healthcare 3.0 tab delimited files, and let's look at the coaching tips. So each one of these tab delimited files is going to follow roughly the same format. So on the very first line, we'll have the headers, or the descriptions of the data that's contained in here. So we know that this particular tab delimited file has the coaching tip name, then it's followed by the actual coaching tip, the coaching tip type, and then it has the framework. And after the first line are the individual records. So each record should be on its own line, and we parse each one of these lines as a separate record. So this line number 2 is distinct from line number 3. And now each one of these lines, it's also tab delimited. So we know that 360 or multi-rated reviews is followed by a tab. That means that that is the coaching tip name, and then it's followed by the actual coaching tip, and then we see another tab, and then we have the coaching tip type, which is improving operations. Finally, the framework itself. So each one of these files is going to follow the same format, and when we deliver in tab delimited format, you'll receive a framework, which is a folder, and the files will be contained within that folder. So said differently, here's my Healthcare 3.0 framework. Here's, for example, the insurance industry framework, the IT framework, and they all have their individual data files within it. Now, the other thing is we have relationships between that data. So the coaching tips that we just saw are the individual data points. And as we looked in the Excel file, that data is related to a competency. And so some of the tab delimited files are the links. And so as we saw in Excel, we have a link between a competency and an individual coaching tip. And that's what these links tab delimited files do. So we can see here that this interpersonal skills coaching tip is somehow related to the competency with B0050. And that's exactly what's going on here. So to visualize it, we know that this coaching tip, interpersonal skills, is related to B0050. So it's helpful to sort of use a data model, a a description of how these are related in the same way that we look at Excel. I have two files that I use which just kind of describe the data relations and the data themselves. So to walk through those from right to left, we have the individual data points. You have learning references, development statements, coaching tips, interview questions, and each one of these is going to have its own data therein. Now each piece of information, learning reference for example, is going to be identified by something. So it's unique, and because of that it has a learning reference code. Other pieces of information such as development statements, coaching tips, or interview questions use the name as the identifier. And we know that those relate back to the competency. And so if we look at our competency, we have the competency ID, and we have that link file that joins the two. So our competency ID is referenced in the link file, and we know that the learning reference ID maps to an actual learning reference. And the same thing goes for, let's say, our coaching tips. We have a competency ID, and then that maps to the coaching tip name. Now, not everything is joined in this manner. So the other way that things are related are just through the fields themselves. So we haven't seen the job-related data, but you can I think you're familiar enough to understand how jobs work. We have inside of any given company or industry a family, a collection of jobs. So that's described by the name and description, but identified by the ID. And then a job that fits into that job family. And we can see that that job has both its ID and the focus ID, which maps to the family ID. And then similarly, we have profiles that describe what skills a particular job should have. And those profiles then contain the competency ID, which describes the individual skills and the learning paths and development statements, coaching tips, etc. So that's the organization of this data. And admittedly, it is a little difficult to kind of sort out at the beginning, but I think as you kind of dig into it and start to look at these two data model files that I've provided, you'll have a better understanding of how things kind of interrelate to each other and then how you can apply that into your system. So that's tab delimited, and the final format is just XML. And we've really covered the basics and most of the information about the data inside of these files. XML simply presents that data in a different format. So rather than delivering each one as an individual framework and the data therein, these are delivered in batch. So we can deal with all the coaching tips as one large file. And then within here, we can see here's an individual coaching tip right here, the coaching tip name, the coaching tip, and then the coaching tip type. So it's the same data that we saw in our tab delimited file, it's simply in a different format. And which format you desire to use within your system or to integrate into your application is a matter of preference. So now that you've seen the talent frameworks, the content, as well as the organization of that content, the obvious next question is, what do I do with that? And that's going to vary based on kind of the integration needs that you have, or the application specific usages of our content. But allow me to give just a bit of guidance on what you could do. And so this is going to be a demonstration of a small program that I've written that takes our content and puts it into a different format and allows us to work with it so that we can do something different with it. So we're not looking at this from the perspective of the last mile. How do I get it into my database, or I needed to load it into this legacy system. Rather, we're looking at it as, how do I go from the format that IBM gave me and possibly into something intermediate that more closely matches the design, the need of our application organization. So with that, what I've written is this Talent Frameworks series of applications, very small applications. They're written in a technology called Node.js. So if I can find my browser, it's available for download, And the JS stands for JavaScript. So JavaScript is the language that we write these applications in, and Node is somewhat of the framework that allows us to build these applications, run them, but actually gives us access to lots and lots of other, they call them packages, but you can think of this as open source modules that we combine like building blocks to build an application. And so that's one of the reasons that I prefer Node.js, is that I have a very lightweight framework that I can build these applications, but lots and lots of open source packages that we can dovetail to build a larger solution. So that's what I've written, and we'll take a look at this in kind of three parts to sort of demonstrate some of the tools that I've written. The first is going to be the parser, which is us taking the Talent Frameworks tab delimited content and putting it in a different format. There's the redactor, which takes that content and actually redacts parts of it. So you can think of it like those movies where the government or the lawyers get a document that has lots of black lines through the words in it. The same thing applies where we don't want to necessarily give away all of our content. For example, a sales demonstration or a client that's requested it for review purposes, we redact quite a bit of it, maybe leaving 10% of it so that they get a feel for what is inside that content, but gets an idea of the breadth of our content. And then the transformer, meaning I have the text, the descriptions, maybe the job responsibility, the coaching tip in a plain text format, but that's not necessarily the format that we need it in for our organization, or there's other occurrences. Well, we call a competency a skill. Can you make that change? This gives us the flexibility to simply kind of change that on the fly, and we'll take a look. So if you recall, we had a series of folders that corresponded to our frameworks. And so this root is telling us, where are those folders located? And then there's another destination variable that allows us to say, where should the files that are being parsed be written to? And then what I'm doing here is I'm simply going through each one of those framework directories, and I'm giving it an output file. So this output file format is something called JavaScript object notation. And you can think of this as kind of like the fourth option we have to give you data in. So we had talked about Excel, tab delimited, XML. This parser puts things into JavaScript object notation format, and we'll explore why that's advantageous very shortly. So we iterate over all of these frameworks, and we emit the corresponding JavaScript object notation file. And so let's take a look at how that works very briefly. And forgive my typing skills. So we will activate the parser here, and then we'll run this application. So I come over here and I can type node and then the file name, and let's run it. And you'll see output, and it's just some informational scrolling and log messages that I've written. And so it's parsed all those files, and what it's done is it's output those files into this directory here called data. And so we looked at the healthcare file earlier in tab delimited format. This is it in JavaScript object notation. And the reason that I prefer JavaScript object notation, let me just collapse these very briefly, is that we take that data that previously was laid out, strewn about in tab delimited format, and we give it some structure. So these curly braces relate to an object, so you can think of it kind of like the container that has information, and that information is denoted by these labels. And so we have competencies, we have learning references, development statements, jobs, job families. Really all the data that we saw earlier in tab delimited format is now contained in here. And then furthermore, it's in a structure. So if I come into my competencies, I can see that this competency, B0050, is an object. And so if I expand that object, I see all the data in here, and then here are those learning references. It's a list. Here are the activity or the development statements, also a list, and coaching tips and interview questions. And those relate back to the actual data elements, which are objects as well. So here are my learning references. I've denoted them by their identifier, and then each learning reference, has the fields therein. So really, it's just a way of, again, giving us some structure to the tab delimited format. And so that gives me the ability to do other things. Now that I have it in a structure that I can work with, we could integrate that into a NoSQL database very easily, or we can do other things with it. And so one of the other things that we can do is this transformer that I talked about. So this idea that the data that you have IBM is quite good, but we call maybe a competency something else, or the text data that you've given me, we'd like to wrap with some other information. And so that's one of the requests that I received was, the job responsibilities that you have, we have those in a different format. We have them in HTML is the request that came in from one of my partners. And so what we can do is we can transform that data. And so to show you that, I can turn on the transformer. So now it's going to work with that JavaScript object notation that we saw earlier. And then what it takes in is a function, kind of a statement of what should be done. And the way this function works is it says, me, the program, I will give you some value, and then you tell me which labels you want to work with and how you want to manipulate that value. So what this little bit of code right here is doing is it's saying, for every label that's the job responsibility 1, 2, 3, and 4, take the original value, which is the job responsibility in its plain text format, and wrap it inside of some other information. So that's the HTML document that my partner asked. And so now we have all of that Talent Frameworks data that we need to work with, and we can manipulate the format. And so if I go and run this application one more time, it's gone through all of those data types, and we'll go back to our healthcare. We'll open it up and let me collapse some of these down. And now here's a job, this particular one right here. And we can see that job responsibility 1, 2, or 3, or 4 is now in a different format, right? It's different than the plain text. We've now wrapped it in this bit of HTML that was the requirement from the partner. So now we have a way that, any of the data that's in here, we have a mechanism to sort of clean it up, to go through it in a very efficient but batch format. Okay, and the last one is may or may not be useful to you, but it is the redactor. Its job, as I said, was to take the Talent Frameworks data and redact a large portion of it, leaving only some sampling, and that sampling was typically useful in demonstration purposes. So I'll run this one last time. And then what we get back, if we go back and look at our healthcare data, is so here's a competency, as we saw previously. So it has all of its data. You can see that it's not redacted. But now we've got the redacted part. So we take that wording and we convert that letter, that word, to these stars, so that you can't read it. Now some of it is left behind so that people can get an understanding, or it's really not that sensitive intellectual property. So we leave it behind. But if I go through some of these, we'll redact about 10% of the content. That's configurable. But if you're going to go through here, we'll eventually get to one that's not redacted. So that's the general format. Again, it comes in handy if you need to give someone a copy of the data but don't exactly want to give them all of our data. And again, because this content is somewhat either proprietary or sensitive, once we give away that content, we can't ask for it back. it's very helpful in those situations. So again, these scripts are very small. They've been written to be quite efficient, but also very usable to maybe even non-technical audience. So I think those that with just a bit of JavaScript would have, rudimentary JavaScript skills would have a way to go ahead and manipulate this data and then do something with it. And uh, the do something with it will be the subject of the next demonstration. Okay, and by now we've looked at the talent frameworks themselves, the content and the organization of that content, really the data view, as it were. We've started to work with that data through the scripts that I've shown. Really the last step is actually doing something with that data, right? Building an application around it. And one of the things that I wanted to build personally as a software developer and one that works with our partners in sort of applying this data to the applications that partners build was just to show how much breadth and depth that we have. It's hard to convey that in a meaningful way without some type of kind of visual reference. So one of the things that I wrote is this Talent Frameworks Explorer application. And I can go ahead and run that. And that will come up. And this application, again, is being written in JavaScript. We're using an open source framework called Angular to build out really what amounts to a web presentation on all that data, the JavaScript object notation data that we parsed and created. And so what this allows me to do is very easily browse through that data and almost engage in type of a conversation about what is the information that's of interest to either the client or the partner, and what information do we have, and how might we use it to build another application. So to give you an example, I have this menu where I can select the various frameworks that we have. We've been working with the healthcare framework, so I'll select it. And along the top, you'll see a variety of links, and these apply to the types of information that we have in there. So if we're working with a partner's application that is kind of focused on the hiring process, maybe it's a video interview application, we might be solely interested in really the interview questions. What interview questions, IBM, do you have? And we can respond that, well, we have approximately 2,911 of them. And furthermore, we get down into these groupings, these classifications of the individual data. So we can see that some of these interview questions are problem specific, deals with their knowledge, might deal with emerging trends. And the way that this application that I've written is structured is now we can begin exploring it. So perhaps we're interested in the questions that relate to HIPAA. So just like you go to, say, your Amazon and you do your shopping, I can come in here and kind of search for something, and then I can also get a winnowed result, so we can see that there's 4 of these interview questions that are related to HIPAA. Or I can come in and say, I'm really interested in only those particular interview questions that are related to trends. And now I can begin thumbing through these and kind of understanding what is the data that we have. And so that, I would say, design is replicated across a couple of the other data types that we have. So maybe we're interested in, we have them as an employee, let's talk about skills development. So this is what things could they be doing to better themselves professionally. So we have about 2,700 of those, closer to 2,800. What coaching tips as a manager or someone that is a peer of the employee could I be giving them? About 3,000 of those. What learning resources could they utilize to go and further their professional development? We have about 2,900 of those. So this really just gives us an idea, and we're limited here to the healthcare framework, but we have 19 other frameworks, a way for us to browse that breadth of data and start to understand exactly what do we have available and how might it fit the partners or clients' needs. Now, The other thing this application allows us to do is it becomes kind of a launch pad for prototyping. What could we build and what would that look like? So if we go over to something like the jobs tab, we can see again same thing. The ability to search and apply these facets. But I can go and I can delve deeper into the data. So here we see the actual job, its description, some of the metadata and those responsibilities we saw earlier. Or I can come to something like a competency, which we saw has a bit more information because there's relationships, right? Competencies describe other things like which coaching tips or interview questions or development statements are related. And I could come over to one that we saw earlier, knowledge of the organization, and I might say, given the competency knowledge of an organization, where do you fall? Maybe it's a self-assessment. So are you basic understanding? Do you have working experience, extensive experience? And then perhaps even score yourself, or as a manager, have a monthly, yearly, whatever the time frame is, checkpoint where we can assess. They're strong in these areas, they're weaker in these areas, and as a result of perhaps being weak in some areas, we can, as an informed manager, give some recommendations. So perhaps we can come in and provide these development goals, and give them suggestions on how they can better themselves. If it's a self-assessment, maybe the candidate or the employee could come in and mark this as complete, type in their information. Again, if you're a partner that's building a skills management application, an applicant tracking system, what have you, this is a way for you to record that information and store it within your system. Those coaching tips that we saw earlier, is this something as a manager I've gone and I've given them. As a partner, you can be building applications that are tracking that this is being done and what is the business outcomes that the employee has achieved as a result of that. Really, the sky's the limit, and the data, as we saw, is just there to give your application the framework, give your application the content by which you can start creating additional value by building your own application around this talent frameworks content. So I hope that's inspired you just a bit. If you have any questions on how to get started, how to use any of the tools that I've shown, or how to discuss any ideas that you might have and where they might take you as a partner or client, feel free to get in touch with me. Thank you.